Make your own 3-tier gather skirt following this simple step-by-step tutorial. This is a great project for beginners as well as advanced sewists. I'll give you tips on fabric selection, taking measurements, and gathering techniques. Let's dive in. For this project, fabric selection is really important as well as every sewing project. I would recommend something soft and drapey, such as cotton, lawn, or linen, or rayon. If you pick something too stiff, it'll get very heavy because there's a lot of yardage in this project, and it won't gather as well. If you pick something that's too lightweight though, and that's see-through, you're gonna have to consider adding a lining or wearing a slip underneath, which I don't prefer to do. You might want to check though, if it's just slightly see-through, once we add all these gathers in, it will no longer be see-through. So you could gather it up and see if that works. I'm going to be choosing this beautiful watercolor floral from Spoonflower. I love buying from Spoonflower as I like to support the artisans, and I love matching these designs with the fabric of my choice. This is a cotton spandex jersey. I did make this skirt one time in the past. I made it out of a white jersey that I got at Mood Fabrics online. I did find that that fabric ended up being a little heavy, so once we got all that yardage in, it was a little heavy to wear, but I love it anyway, and I wear it all the time, and because it is a little heavier, I can wear it in the winter as well as the summer. So I'm hoping this one will be maybe slightly lighter. You can see it's very soft and it'll be drapey, and I think it's going to really gather nicely. So now let's talk measurement. I've created a free downloadable guide that includes all the instructions step by step of how to create this skirt. Including in that are these tables that give you a very clear explanation of how to take the measurements, because it can get a little confusing. The first table gives you all the formulas for each of the tiers. So we have a waistband tier that we have to create, then we have the 3 skirt tiers. And the second table I've included is one that gives you some sample measurements. So in this one, you can see I've included measurements so you can get a understanding of how that all works with actual measurements. And the third table I've included is everything that's all blank, which allows you to enter your measurements and carefully calculate exactly which measurements you need. So we'll go back here to this one with all the formulas, and I'll walk you through how we're going to do these measurements. Instead of starting with the waist measure, which you would think you would, I'm going to start with the hip circumference. So I'm going to have that as A. The reason I do that is I wanted to easily pull over my hips. So in this instance, you can work with a woven or with a knit fabric, and it'll still fit over your hips without having to add in any sort of closure, like a zipper and buttons and those kind of things. So I find that much easier. So we're going to have our hip measurement, the hip circumference measurement here, and we're going to add in 1 inch of ease. You can be a little flexible here. I like 1 inch of ease just to make it a little bit more comfortable to wear. You may like your clothes a little tighter and you could just add no ease there. Or if you like things a little looser, maybe go up to 1.5 inch ease. I wouldn't go beyond that range though. So anywhere between 0 and 1.5 would be good. And then we're going to add in 1 inch of seam allowance. So in this instance, you need to add seam allowance on both sides. So this 1 inch actually is 1/2 inch of seam allowance for each side of each piece. You can change if you're more comfortable with different seam allowance. Perhaps you like 5-inch seam allowances, or maybe you like a 1/4 inch seam allowance. In the instance of a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you would have a 1/4 inch on this side and a 1/4 inch on that side. So that would be a total here of 1/2 inch. So that's completely up to you. So then we get to the final measurement, which is going to be our hip circumference plus 1 inch ease plus whatever your seam allowance is. That gets us the final measurement of B. So B is going to be our final measurement here for the length of the waistband, and you can see I've put it here. It is also going to be the length of our top tier. Now this is my preference. I do not like to add lots of gathers to my top tier because it just adds more bulk. You can perhaps choose to make this wider, but in this example, we're not going to add any more ease. Now you might also wonder, I want to get back to the waistband. You think, well, this is my hip measurement. It's going to be way too big for my waist. The elastic that we encase inside this waistband is going to be our waist measurement. So it will gather a little bit here. So this top tier will have a little bit of the gather as it's the difference between our hip measurement and our waist. So there'll be some slight gathers, but not a lot. That's just how I prefer to make it. So here we go. Our top tier length is easy. We're going to do it the same as our waistband. Then we're going to move to the middle tier. So we'll start with B, which is the length of our top tier, and then we're going to multiply it times 1.5. You do have some flexibility with this multiplier of 1.5. I personally do most of my gathers at 1.5, but if you could go up to potentially multiply it times 2 to get more gathers, or probably the most I do is 2.5, or it's a very light fabric 3, but you really get it gets quite long if you start multiplying by 3 there. So if you have lightweight fabrics, you might want to go a little bit higher multiplier, but for heavier weight fabrics, you definitely want to not do that many gathers because it gets very bulky and difficult to work with. So you would take your top tier length times 1.5, and that gets you C. We're going to add in a seam allowance. So then we get our final measure for the middle tier is D. So you can see here, our final measure is D. Then to come with our bottom tier, we're going to start with D. So you can see we have D here, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to multiply the length of D times 1.5 to get E. We're going to add on our seam allowance, and we get then the final measure of F. So you can see our bottom tier, the final measure is F. Then we have to think about how tall we want each of these to be. So let's start with the waistband. Typically, you're going to put in an elastic inside the casing anywhere from 1/2 inch to 2 inches. And so let's assume that we're putting an elastic of 1 inch in this instance. So the height of our elastic is going to be 1. We're going to multiply that by 2. Now the reason we multiply it by 2 is we're going to fold over this waistband. There's going to be, a fold line right here down the middle because we need to encase the elastic. So we're going to take the 1, which is the height of the elastic, times 2. So that gives us 1 times 2 equals 2. We're going to add in our seam allowance of 1. That gives us the waistband height of K. So right here, our waistband height is K. Now we have to figure out these 3. I'm going to, for this instance, keep all of these 3 tiers equal heights. You can do them different heights, but let's walk through the example of having them all the same. So first we have to figure out how long we want to make our skirt. So if we look at this example over here, we've decided that our skirt length is going to be 43 inches, and you just need to figure that out. You measure from your waist down to where you want the skirt to end. If you want it to end in your mid-thigh or at your knee, or if you want a maxi length, whatever it is, you decide and then you put it in here. So as we have the skirt length here of G, we're going to subtract the height of the elastic because the waistband is going to take a little bit of room. It's very minor, so you probably wouldn't even have to do that, but just to be precise, we're going to take that out. So in this instance, we wanted our skirt length to be 43. We're going to take out the 1 inch, which represents the waistband. That gives us a total height left for the skirt, or length left of the skirt, of 42 inches. We're going to take that 42 inches and divide by 3. And the 3 is we need to divide that 42 inches amongst these 3 skirt tiers. So that gives us 14 inches. So each would be 14, but of course we have to add in our seam allowance. So ultimately we end up that we need 15 inches for each of our to your height. And this bottom one, we're going to actually add in one more extra inch for the hem. Or if you want to add 2 inches for the hem, you can be a little flexible. If you want to really, really narrow hem, you can add in a half an inch, but just add in hem. So you can see here, our bottom tier, I gave all this information over here. I've indicated where the grain line is. And there you go. If math is not your thing, no problem. To make it super easy, I put together a downloadable guide that includes all calculations, step-by-step sewing instructions, and all the tips you'll need. You can find the link in the description below. I cut out all my pattern pieces. I prefer to use paper to cut up my pattern rather than just doing it right onto the fabric, since if I want to make this skirt again, I will have it all cut out, so I don't have to remeasure everything. So up here I have the waistband, and I decided I'm going to put a 2-inch elastic into my waistband, so it's a little bit taller. I have the top tier, the middle tier, and the bottom tier. Since my fabric is 58 inches wide, I can cut the top tier one time on the fold here. But for my middle and my bottom tier, I have to cut each 2 times on the fold. So there'll be 2 of this pattern piece and 2 of that pattern piece, so I have all the length I need. So that'll depend on how wide your fabric is. You'll have to figure out if you have to have a few pieces for these lower ends. So now I'm going to lay out my fabric and I will cut these pattern pieces out. One thing I do want to show you is we're going to do the grain line here. I'll put the grain line on. So you want the grain line to go up and down on the pattern. So I'm going to just do a nice square so it's up and down on all pieces. So when you align this onto your fabric, it'll be on the grain line. Now all the pattern pieces are cut out. I have 4 pieces. I have the waistband and the top tier, the middle tier, and the bottom tier. I made sure that the straight of grain was going this direction. Now we're going to start sewing. So I'm going to take my waistband and I'm going to do right sides together. And we're just going to be forming loops. So I'm going to sew the short end together on each of these tiers, so we have full loops. For the bottom and the middle tier, you can see we have, because we didn't have enough width in our fabric, we had to cut 2 on the fold. So we will put these together like this end. So it'll have to be 2 seam lines for these. We're going to sew here. And then we make sure we don't twist it. So bring it around, still right sides together, and then we'll do the other side as well. Just very important as they get longer that you're not twisting the fabric and then sewing it incorrectly. So here we go. We're going to pin this together, and we will do the same thing for the bottom tier, and the top tier will just have 1 seam. So I'll finish this and then I'm going to go sew these, and I'll serge the edges too, just to make a nice clean edge. You can zigzag the edge. This probably wouldn't fray this type of fabric, just depends on what type of fabric you have, but it's good to think about how you're going to finish your edges. I finished sewing each of the tiers. I made it into a loop. You can see this waistband is a loop, and I've nicely finished off the edge with serger. You can do a zigzag stitch if you want there. This is the top tier here. You can see that's also a nice loop. Same thing, these bottom tiers, there's 2 layers here, so it's getting longer. You can see I'm getting longer. And the last one is really, really long and also is a loop. We have 2 pieces of fabric that I sewed together to get all this length that we need. You can see there's a lot of length there. So my next step is going to be to put 2 basting stitches here along the top edge of each of the tiers. A basting stitch is you use the longest stitch on your machine. Mine is a 5, so that's what I'm going to use. Do one at an 1/8 inch away from the edge and the other at a 1/4 inch. You want to make sure that you're inside the seam allowance. My seam allowances are a 1/2 inch. So if I do an 1/8 and a 1/4, I'll stay within the seam allowance. So whatever your seam allowance are, make sure you stay within those. So I'm going to go put these 2 layers on just one side, the upper side on each of these tiers, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how we're going to gather. I have the middle tier and the bottom tier. On each, I put 2 stitches here. I have the longest stitch length, which on my machine is a 5. I did one here at an 1/8 inch away from the edge and the other at a 1/4 inch. And I did the same for the bottom. I did make sure that my pattern of the floral was going in the same direction. So if you do have a pattern, make sure that you're putting the top edge in the right place so all the florals or the pattern goes in the same direction. Then what we're going to do is, you can see I left these really long thread tails. I'm going to be grabbing the thread tails just on one side here. Find them. Okay, there, I got the 2 thread tails, and I'm just going to pull, and we're going to go around and we're going to distribute these gathers the entire way around. Just pull very gently because you do not want to break your thread. If you did break the thread, I would just go and you'd have to sew it again. Or if it was just one thread that broke, I would just use the other thread. That will work as well. But I try very carefully to go gently around so I don't break them. I'm then just distributing the gathers around. I'm going to continue to do this until the length of this is my middle tier, until the length of it is equivalent to my top tier here. So you can see I have notched both the centers here, and we know where the one end is over here where I sewed it, and then I've notched over here as well. So I have notches in all 4 quadrants, so I can easily align the gathers so the notches all match up. So I'll continue to do that, and then we'll be back after I've pinned them all together. So I pinned all the tiers together. Here's the waistband that I pinned to the top tier. You can see the top tier is not gathered because I just didn't want to add bulk there. And then I've added the top tiers pinned to the gathers in the middle tier. And then the middle tier is pinned to the gathers on the bottom tier. So I just carefully distributed the gathers around and pinned thoroughly throughout. So now I'm going to just go sew this at my regular 1/2 inch seam allowance. That will, encase my basting threads. I will probably take those basting threads out afterwards anyway. I've sewed all the tiers together. We have the waistband, the top tier, the gathered middle tier, and the gathered bottom tier. So I sewed them together. I'm going to pull out the basting stitch now, and I'm going to serge these edges. If you don't have a serger, I'd recommend zigzagging the edge, but this probably isn't going to fray, so you could probably just leave it like this as well. It just looks a little neater if you finish it off someplace. for the waistband, what I've done so far is I just folded it over lengthwise, and I put it right sides together here and just sewed it along, and I left an opening at one point right here. I left an opening here so I can put the elastic. I have this roll of elastic. I'm using 2-inch elastic. You can use any width that you are interested in. So just make sure your waistband accommodates that. So I'm going to slip in this to go the whole way around, and once I get the elastic in, I will just then finish closing it up there. So it gives you a really nice waistband. This is just one way of doing a waistband. There's a variety of ways you can do the waistband, but this is the way I like to do it. I'll also serge this edge here, so that'll be a nice finished edge. Okay, so I put the elastic banding in, and I overlapped it by about a 1/2 inch here, and then I zigzagged back and forth many times just to make sure it was really, really secure. I make sure I go over the edges on both sides and then down the middle as well. Then I'm going to pull it inside here. I made sure that it wasn't twisting as I go around, and then I'll just finish up this edge right here. So I can completely enclose it, and then I'm going to go, as I said, I'm going to serge each of the seam lines. I'm going to use my serger to neaten those up. So we're all done. I put in the waistband, and you can see I serged that seam, and the waistband has a few gathers in it because this width is the width of my hips, and then I made the elastic inside the width or the circumference of my waist, which is smaller than my hip. So it does gather it a little bit, but I just prefer, I didn't put gathers in this upper tier because I didn't want to add a lot of bulk in that place. And typically I will put my top over, slightly over the skirt, so you don't see it anyway. So that's how I did that. And look inside here, you'll see that I finished, I did the serger on all the seams, so it has a nice clean edge inside. It's nice and full. I haven't hemmed it yet, and so I'm going to put just a little rolled hem at the bottom here. Sometimes you don't need to hem it because if it doesn't fray, you can just leave it, but this will roll a little bit. So with the hem, it'll keep it from rolling. So that'll be the last thing I will do. But I really love how it came out. I love the fabric, and it's going to be really comfortable to wear this spring. I hope you give it a try to draft and sew your own 3-tier gathered skirt. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments.